You know what I'm talking about. You can spend a ton of time practicing, or at least sitting with your guitar working on stuff, and just feel like you're spinning your wheels, like you're going off in 1,000 different directions, or like what you're working on isn't getting you where you want to go. All I want to talk about today is the idea that you could spend less time actually practicing if you spend a little more time figuring out what to practice, how to practice it, and when to practice it. Okay, so the first thing is what to work on. And the bad news is you can't work on everything, not all at once. The good news is if you have a really dedicated and focused way to practice, you can work on some specific things for a period of time and then go, okay, well, when I get this further down the road, the next thing I'm going to work on is this. So you kind of divide it up into these projects, which may take a few weeks, a few months, a year, but there's always time to get to a point where you're like, okay, I've done what I needed to do with that for now. I'm going to go on to the next thing. So whatever you're going to work on right now, it probably helps to look at it through one of two lenses. What kind of tunes am I trying to learn? Like, are you trying to build repertoire and just get some songs under your fingers? Or are you working on improvising and how to actually do things with those tunes? And those two things actually interact with each other, but it helps to have one or the other as some kind of lens for what you're doing, because everything else is going to come from that. So let's say you're thinking in terms of actual tunes. Well, the practice itself that you're going to do, now you can break down into these three pieces. And working on the tunes themselves, the actual repertoire part, that's the third piece. The first piece is technique, which tends to be this hand. And the second part is the fretboard, or understanding what you're doing. And that tends to come out of this hand. And then the third part is actually doing the repertoire piece itself. So within that, those are the three things you kind of got to focus on, because any tune you're working on is going to have some technical challenges. And for fingerstyle playing in particular, it tends to be how you coordinate the thumb and the fingers. So you're going to need to spend some time isolating from the tune what those rhythmic challenges are and spending some time focused on those. And then when it comes to finding your way around, the more you sort of understand what you're playing, the better that goes. And so in addition to spending some time on technique, spending some time on understanding what these notes are and what you're doing. So, you may have a rhythm that's tricky, and you may need to break that down into just going, well, what is happening here? I'm playing these quarter notes. And what is happening on top? I'm playing that syncopation on top. And that may be something to isolate and work on so that when you go to play the licks, you know what's going on. And likewise over here, what are you actually doing Okay, you're playing the root over here, you're playing the root on top, you're playing flat 5, 4, flat 3, and root. Those are notes of the blues scale. Knowing what you're playing helps you keep it mapped out on the fingerboard. It helps you keep track of it in your head. It just, if you're not just playing by rote, if you're playing with a sense of understanding of what's going on musically behind what you're doing, that's a much stronger position to be operating from. So a little time on technique, a little time on understanding the fretboard. Then when you go to work on the repertoire, let's say you're working on the first 8 bars of a tune, now you're sort of warmed up, you're focused, you've got this hand sharpened up and your sense of time sharpened up from the time you've spent on that. You've got the brain kind of warmed up, you've got a better understanding of the fingerboard. So when you go to do the repertoire piece, you're not just playing by rote, you're not just memorizing tab, you're acquiring a musical understanding of what you're doing as you work on that piece, and working on that piece is providing you with the reasons that you're working on the technique and the musical understanding that you're working on. So altogether, by choosing a piece of repertoire and organizing your practicing around it, now when you sit down to practice, you know why you're working on what you're working on, and it has a direction and a purpose. And this can apply if your primary focus is improvisation too, because generally we want to be able to improvise on songs. So you can take the same idea and apply it to the improvising you're going to do, so that you're still working on these sort of rhythmic rudiments with the right hand, so that you're focused on what you need to be able to do in terms of coordination to improvise. And then it's even more important in terms of improvisation than it is in terms of learning songs, to understand what's going on under your fingers, so you can really expand on that idea. And then the repertoire piece would be actually going and trying to apply this to whatever song or whatever chord progression you're learning to improvise on. So practicing specific licks, practicing maybe some model solos that you've either acquired or transcribed or worked out for yourself, and then working on swapping in licks, moving things around, just getting more fluent, but getting as specific as possible, not just jamming and sort of loosely playing scales over the chords, but working with phrasing, working with licks and ideas, so that you're actually developing a vocabulary of improvisational ideas. And that can be just as effective, and this way of organizing things can be just as effective for that as it is for learning specific songs with specific melodies. So knowing what to practice is the first step. And then the next step is figuring out how to practice it. So we've already kind of divided things up into technique and the fingerboard and repertoire. But beyond that, a couple of specific things. One is this idea of breaking down what you're trying to do as a fingerstyle guitar player into these rudiments, this idea of understanding rhythmically what's going on. Because this is one of the biggest stumbling blocks, especially for beginning finger pickers, is being able to keep the thumb doing what the thumb is supposed to do to lay down a foundation while these people do their thing without screwing up the thumb. So taking a tune and breaking it down in terms of what is the bass line, what is the melody, looking at those things individually, putting them back together. And then in terms of actually sitting down and practicing, taking parts of whatever you're working on and just pulling out the rhythmic content. Like I was saying, if you've got a lick like this, what is the actual relationship between the melody and the thumb rhythmically? And so you're not trying to do two things at once, which are like learn this part and get this coordinated, but just isolating what this hand has to do. And then it just becomes a set of skills, like it's just slow it down as much as you need to get those things coordinated. And over here, there's sort of the specific goal of learning the licks or the melodies that you're working on, and the more general goal of understanding the fingerboard and having a bit of a map of what the notes are, and almost more importantly, what the intervals are in relation to what you're playing. So if you're learning to play a blues in E, it would be really great not just to know the open strings, but to know, the notes of, say, the E blues scale, that this is E and G and A and B and D and E, and actually even here's B flat, the flat 5. And furthermore, like learning those things up the neck, and then learning them in terms of like, well, what are those intervals relative to the root? Like this is the root, this is the flat third, the fourth, the flat 5, the flat 7, the root. And those are things that you just have to pour into your head. And so the more specific you can make it and the more of a practice you can make it, the better. So to literally sit there and play through the notes as slowly as you need to, first to identify what they are in terms of the note names and the interval names, and then to sit there and really just coordinate your brain with your fingers by saying what you're doing at every moment. This is E and G and A and B flat and B. And that might be not hard for you to do in open position, but if you start going up and down each string doing it, G, A, B flat, B, D, E, G, right? And then go backwards, which is even harder. G, E, D, B, B flat, A, G. And then maybe do it in terms of intervals. Root, this is the flat third, this is the fourth, this is the flat 5, this is the 5, this is the flat 7, this is the root, and so on. And you can, that's if you want to do it in that kind of detail, that's a lengthy project, but you can just do a little bit every week, and you can do it with a metronome. It's just a way of training your reflexes, your mental reflexes, to know what's going on over here. So having specific exercises for this hand, having specific exercises that involve the fingerboard and your brain, that can be a really important part of your practice. And then having the repertoire part and having a way to break down and work on repertoire. So you're not just playing through it, but you're taking it apart and putting it back together. So isolating the bass and just saying, well, what is the bass doing on this tune, and working through that. And then playing just the melody. So that you start to hear the melody not as a bunch of numbers on a tab staff, but as a series of phrases. So that you hear, the notes together and they feel vocal and they feel like they're actually saying something, and you can hear the space in between. If you can do that isolated on its own, then when you go back to put it with the bass, you can play the melody in a more expressive way. It'll make more sense musically. And when you go to kind of tie the melody and the bass together, you can look for those moments where the melody lines up for the bass and where it doesn't, and you can hear all of it in relation to the basic pulse. So that's the second part, is having a specific way to work on, or some specific ways to work on, technique and the fretboard and the repertoire itself. So finally, and this is kind of my favorite part, it's the question of when to practice. And kind of tied in with that is how long you practice for, right? So what I mean by this whole idea of spending less time practicing is that it is far easier to show up to practice for a half an hour than to feel like it doesn't count unless you can sit down and spend 2 hours with your guitar. So I have always, or for the longest time, tried to keep my practicing really short and really focused, and just say, okay, I'm going to do a half an hour of this a day. That's what practicing means. And within that, spend 10 minutes on technique and 10 minutes on the fretboard and 10 minutes on repertoire. So it feeds right back into this whole thing of what to practice and how to practice in setting up when to practice. And so by having these specific ways to practice and these specific things to do that tie in directly to the big picture of, well, am I working on repertoire? If so, what repertoire? Am I working on improvisation? If so, improvising on what? Then when it comes time to sit down and practice, it's really focused. And I actually even, often write out for the week, like, here's what I'm doing. Like, this is the technique thing I'm going to do. This is the fretboard thing I'm going to do. This is the repertoire thing I'm going to do. And by limiting it to half an hour, it means like there's no time to goof around. It's like a sit down. It's like, well, I got 10 minutes to work on this, putting on the metronome at this setting. I'm going to do this thing. And then when the 10 minutes are up, I'm done. I'm on to the next thing. And that way I can sit down and go, well, okay, half an hour. Like I would probably waste that half an hour somehow. Let me spend it practicing. And then there's the question of literally when to practice. And I am a huge fan of practicing as early in the day as you can. Now, it's different for everybody and it can be done at any time. But I find that A, it's more likely to get done if it's slotted in somewhere earlier in the day. And B, I just find that, on a totally like unscientific level, the day just goes better if I practice first or if I practice early. So that's just my unsolicited advice on that. I know it's not practical for everybody. And I've also gone through periods where like the only time I could do it was later in the day. And as long as it gets like committed to and gets done, everything's cool. But I find that like, I just feel like a better human being when I've practiced earlier in the day. And the other part of this is it doesn't mean you can't play more than half an hour a day. It just means like the practicing comes first. It's really focused. And then if you feel like working longer on something, you just go back and work on it more, or you play more, or you do whatever you do. But this is a very specific and very focused way to practice. So you know that you can get in and get out. It's like if you're going to like, if you're a runner or you do some kind of working out or whatever, it's like, you know how far you're going to run that day. Like you're not going to run all day. And like once you've done the run, you're like, okay, I did that. I did the thing I said I was going to do. Now I can go on and do other stuff. You might walk around, you might do other things, but like the running part is done and you've like satisfied that like quota for the day or whatever it is. So that's my take on that. So what to practice, how to practice, and when to practice it. If you can get that dialed in, then you don't have to practice as much because your practicing is really focused and it's getting one specific idea moved further down the line every time you sit down to play. And the other really great thing about it is when you sit down to practice, you know what you're going to work on. If you work this stuff out ahead of time and you've thought about it, then it's not a matter of spending the first 15 or 20 minutes in the chair going, where was that lesson and what am I working on and am I going to keep working on that? If you sort of set yourself up with this at the beginning of the week or before the week comes or whatever it is, it's way more efficient because you can just sit down and say, okay, I'm practicing. The first thing I'm practicing is this, and then this, and then this, and then you're in and you're out and it's done. So what to practice, how to practice, when to practice it. So this approach is an integral part of how I teach both repertoire and improvisation inside my membership, the Fingerstyle 5. And this month, if you'd like to download the one-page PDF that we use inside the membership to organize the practice week, you can go to the link below or the link on screen to download your own copy and fill it out and try out some of these ideas that I've been talking about today. And if you'd like to learn more about the membership itself, just go to fretboardconfidential.com. If you've got a question or a comment about today's lesson, I would love to hear from you. Just scroll down and leave it in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.